Hello again and welcome to the exploitation section of the course. It is time we learn how to gain access to our target. What we managed to do for now is, with the help of our Kali Linux machine, we managed to identify our target and find out a lot of information about it. Remember, once we were starting, we didn't know anything about it. But after, with the help of different tools such as Nmap, Nessus, WhatWeb, and others, we managed to gather enough information about our target to be able to exploit it. We have discovered opened and closed ports. We also discovered services running on those ports, including their versions. We found out what operating system was our target running. And we have also tried finding vulnerabilities to see whether the target has some known issues or bugs. In other words, we performed information gathering, scanning, and vulnerability analysis. Right now, the next step is to use that information we have to gain access to our target. Here is how the process goes. Imagine this is our target, and these are the information that we gathered for it. It is running Windows 10. We found out it has an older version of Windows 10 that hasn't been updated lately. We found 3 open ports and 1 filtered port, and we know for sure that one of those open ports has a vulnerable software running on it since we also performed vulnerability analysis. Once we found out this information, the next step is to extract useful information from this. So in this case, what we would find most interesting would be these 2 facts: an outdated Windows 10 operating system and a vulnerable software on port 1234. This is what we will use to attack the target. We would then exploit the target's vulnerability and gain access to it. But wait a second. What do I mean we would exploit the target? How do we do it exactly? And what does exploit the target even mean? Well, exploiting the target, in other words, is using its vulnerability that we discovered to send something called payload. What a payload is a program that we deliver to the target after the exploit. Usually, this program is something that allows us to execute commands on target system and navigate through its files and folders. Now, I know what you're thinking. It is still a little unclear to you as to how this works exactly. Don't worry, in the next 2 videos we will explain in details what exactly happens once we exploit a vulnerability and what type of payloads exist and which ones we will use the most. For now, it is important to remember that payload is a program that we drop after exploiting a target. And in 99.9% of cases, this will be a program that allows us to execute commands on target system, or also known as a shell. The first step would be us exploiting the target and sending shell or payload with it. That payload will then be on target's machine and it will execute. Once it executes, what it essentially does is it tells the target machine connect to that other machine and allow it to execute commands on your system. And that other machine would be our Kali Linux. And the third step is pretty easy. We just send the commands that we want our target to execute. We navigate through files, run other programs, and in return, target sends us an output of the command that we executed. Picture it like using target's terminal from our Kali Linux machine. However, there is one problem with this. Imagine we have 2 different targets, target A and target B. And let's say target A has a known vulnerability. It is running some outdated software on port 5555, for example, and in that case, we would do what we just explained, which is exploit the target through the vulnerability and deliver the payload that will allow us to control that target machine. Well, this scenario would only work if the target has a vulnerability. But what if it doesn't have a vulnerability? What if all of its softwares are fully updated and secured? What then? In that case, we would do something similar. We would deliver the payload to the target, just this time we cannot do it through an exploit. which also means we can't make the payload auto-execute on the target, since once again, there is no exploit that we can do. We must deliver the payload to target using different way, and also we must make it execute a different way. Well, in this case, social engineering comes in play. We would try to trick the user to open our payload by themselves. They must run it for us. How would we do that? Well, we could use different methods of delivering the payload. We could, for example, use an email containing our payload that we perhaps masked to look like an image or a different file type. We would also make sure that email looks legit and target doesn't think twice before trying to open that image. We could spoof our email address so it looks like someone that our target knows, so they would never think that the image we sent could contain something malicious. Once they open that image, in the background our payload executes, and it grants us access to their machine without them even knowing it. This is just an example. There are multiple ways that we can do this. If you were, for example, physically close to the target, you could infect it over USB drive. Plug the USB drive in the target machine and execute payload manually. But something like this you will almost never do, due to a higher risk of course, and if you were even able to come close to the target machine. Nonetheless, these are the two different possibilities. Either target is vulnerable, or it isn't. However, if it isn't, we don't just quit. We try different methods. Throughout this section, we will cover another big tool that all hackers use, and that tool is called Metasploit Framework. It contains thousands of exploits, and all of them are already in our Kali Linux machine. All we need to do is learn how to use them and how to run them. This is something we will cover shortly in great details. Let's start hacking. What exactly is a vulnerability? We talked about process of gaining access and making target execute our commands, but let us explain what happens once we exploit a vulnerability. Well, let's start like this. And trust me, if it sounds a little complicated, it will be more clear once we get to practical examples in the next few videos. For now, let's explain it like this. We know that developers write programs. They use their code, which can be written in any language, whether it is Python, Java, C, or some other language. The goal for developer is to create a software using a programming language. And as we mentioned, that software can be based on any language whatsoever. Once the software is complete and it goes through a few test checks and security checks, then that software gets deployed on machines and it can be ran from those machines. This can be any type of software, it doesn't matter. However, the problem occurs once that software is open to the internet. For example, FTP is open on some machines and servers for file transfer protocol. SSH could also be open for secure shell connection. HTTP could be open to host a web page that clients connect to. Basically, if your software is hosted on an open port, then it is also open for possible attacks from the outside. And as we already know that the software is consisted of code that developers wrote, problem occurs if that code is not well written, if it has some bugs. Now it doesn't necessarily mean that if there is a bug that we can exploit the target, but sometimes those bugs can be critical, and the attacker could use that bug to make software act in a way that it is not intended to. That's called exploitable vulnerability. Usually once exploited, we drop a payload or a shell back, so we can control that machine and do what we want with it. Once a bug or vulnerability is discovered, it gets that name that we've seen for vulnerabilities in NASes that starts with CVE, and then the year of when the vulnerability first occurred. A vulnerability that exists and has not been patched yet by the vendors is called 0 day. Usually as soon as critical 0 day is discovered, it gets patched almost immediately, but you will see examples of 0 days that were used for months before anyone found out about them. The most known recent one was in 2017, when the WannaCry ransomware occurred and infected a bunch of hospitals and police stations. It was based on an exploit called Eternal Blue which was created and used by NSA. They never reported it and used it for their attacks until those exploits got stolen from them and got leaked. We will see in this course a lot of recent 0 days that are now patched. Some of them will even be as recent as just few months ago. However, all of this makes sense if the target has a vulnerability. But remember, vulnerabilities don't always have to be of technical nature. Imagine a company with a bunch of networks, servers and machines, fully secured and also protected by the best firewall. No security holes, no vulnerabilities. We can't even scan the target to figure out its infrastructure because its protection is so good. Now, imagine an employee that works there. Let's call him John. And let's focus on John at the moment. John likes cars. He usually searches for car pictures and videos while working. One day he gets an email from a person that has email name exactly the same as his colleague. In that email, there is a car picture. He sees that the email is coming from his colleague, so he doesn't question it. Therefore, he opens that picture at work, and it indeed is a car picture. But little does he know, that email was us spoofing an email for him, so that at the first glance it looks like it comes from his colleague, and that picture opened a car image, but it also ran our malicious program in the background. What happens next? Now, John's work computer is infected, and he doesn't even know it. And from his computer, we can compromise the entire network and the entire inside of that company. Now this is just an example, but stuff like this happens a lot. Matter of fact, most of the hacking that happens that you read about happens this way, and not by someone finding a 0-day vulnerability on a fully secured company. Remember, people are always the weakest spot. So if you can hack something through them, why would you bother trying to discover a technical vulnerability that might not even be there? In the next video, we're only left to talk briefly about shells and different types of shells that we want to drop once exploiting the target. After that, we are ready to get our hands dirty and start gaining access to our target machine. See you in the next video. Before we get into Metasploit framework and its structure inside of our Kel Linux, let us first talk about reverse shells and bind shells. As we already mentioned, shell is our access to the target machine. With the help of shell, we execute commands and control the target system. So, shell is essentially our payload that we drop on machine after exploiting it. However, there are two different types of shells. We got reverse shells and bind shells. Now, reverse shells are something that you will use a lot. It works on principle of target machine trying to connect back to our Kel Linux machine. For this to work, on our Kel Linux machine, we must first listen for the incoming connection over some port. Then we exploit the target and drop a shell which will tell that target machine to connect to our port on Kel Linux that we're listening on. After it completes the connection, we can then control that machine. On the other hand, bind shell is when the target machine opens their port for us to connect to. In this case, it is the target machine that is listening for the incoming connection on that port. And we are the ones that must connect to that port. After we do it, we can control that target machine. However, there is one problem with bind shell. And it is also one of the main reasons why we won't use it that much. And that is because firewall can forbid target machines to open a port. Many firewalls could have a rule that says don't open any random port for security reasons. Therefore, our bind shell would not work even after exploiting the target. However, reverse shells will always work. Why? Well, because the target in that case is just connecting to us. It is the same process as when the target visits a website. It connects to a port on that web server, and it gets the web page of that website back. Just in this case, it will connect to a port on our Kel Linux machine, and we will establish a shell like that. That's why reverse shell is always a better option if possible. Alright, cool. Now we are ready to start introducing ourselves to the Metasploit framework. the number one tool that we will use for exploitation. It is as important as Nmap, and we will use it a lot, so it is important we get its basics down first. It is not hard, however, it will take some practice to get used to it. Let's get straight into it. Welcome back. Let us talk about Metasploit framework. We already mentioned that we will use this tool a lot to exploit different targets and their vulnerabilities. But there are a few things we need to learn first about it before we get to use it. Remember when I told you that Metasploit framework offers us thousands of exploits that we can use for Windows, macOS or Linux? While that is true, Metasploit offers us a whole lot more things that we can use besides the exploits. Matter of fact, exploits are just one of 7 modules that we can get with Metasploit. Besides them, we also get payloads, auxiliary modules, encoders, evasion modules, NOPs, and post-exploitation modules. If you are new to all of this, you probably have no idea what each of them are. Don't worry, we will explain it right now. First, to navigate to the Metasploit framework directory, we can type cd/user/share and then Metasploit-framework. You can just type meta and then tab it to autocomplete it. If I press here enter, and if I type ls right here in the Metasploit framework directory, we're going to see quite a few things. One of the most important things right here is this MSF console. And this is an executable file. This is our program. If we wanted to run Metasploit, we would just type MSF console in the terminal and it would open the Metasploit framework. The MSF Venom is also very important. This is a tool that we will use to generate a payload or a shell that we use to control the target machine with. But for this video, what we want to explain is this modules directory. If we change to that directory, so cd modules, and I type ls here, we will see those 7 modules that I mentioned. Let's talk about each one of them a little bit. We're already familiar with exploits, right? Let's go to that directory first. So cd exploits. And just to remind ourselves that an exploit module or program executes a sequence of commands to target a specific vulnerability in a system or application. It takes advantage of that vulnerability in order to provide us an access to that machine. There are a few different types of exploits, such as for example buffer overflow, code injection, web application exploits. But what is also important to mention right here regarding Metasploit is that once we type ls inside of this exploits directory, you will see these exploits are split into different groups. We got Windows exploits, OS X exploits, Linux exploits, Firefox exploits, and many others as well. And if we go to any of them, for example, let's go to Windows exploits, and I type ls right here, we will get even more division of exploits. All of the Windows exploits that we have are divided into a bunch of other submodules such as FTP, firewall, SMTP, SMB, and others. And all of them contain exploits for those specific things. If we navigate to, for example, HTTP Windows exploits, so let's go there. And I clear the screen, type ls right here. We will see there is a lot of them for the HTTP. And this .rb that all of these files have is just an extension for Ruby language. All of the exploits in Metasploit framework are coded inside of our Ruby language. And each one of these programs right here exploits a different vulnerability. If you were, for example, interested in how some of these work, you could open the code of an exploit using Nano Editor. Let's see, for example, this one. If I nano it, it will open the code of this exploit. And if you know Ruby language, you could figure out how this exploit works, right? It also gives us a description right here. So this exploits a stack buffer overflow in the Webster HTTP server. The server and source code was released within an article from the Microsoft System Journal in February 1996, titled Write a Simple HTTP. So this is an old exploit. But you can do this for any file that you want. You can just open it and see the code of that specific exploit. And that's how they are stored in Kali Linux. Let's also mention other modules that exist besides these. So if I go back to the modules directory and type ls, let's next talk about the auxiliary modules. So if I change directory to auxiliary and I type ls right here, then we will see that auxiliary modules are also split into different categories, as we can see right here. And an auxiliary module does not execute a payload like an exploit module does. It is used to perform different actions such as scanning, fuzzing, or denial of service attacks. These modules can sometimes be used in first two stages of penetration test, as there is a lot of them that perform fingerprinting and vulnerability scanning. If we go to one of these submodules, for example, let's go to sniffer submodule. If I type cd sniffer, type ls, well, it seems that there is only one sniffer in Metasploit. And we can see again it is also coded in Ruby language because of the .rb extension. If we go to a different auxiliary submodule, for example, let's go to this one, which is spoofing. So let's go to the spoofers, clear the screen, type ls. We can see they're also divided into even more submodules based on what it is spoofing. So it can spoof ARP requests, it can spoof DNS, it can spoof MDNS, and others as well. And all of these spoofers we can use for our attacks if we need to. Good. Those are the auxiliary modules. Now, you can always explore others as well if you want to check out what different files this module has. But we're going to continue and we're going to cover the next module from the Metasploit framework, which is the post-exploitation module. And if I change directory to the post-exploitation module, clear the screen and type ls, this module is used, as its name says, after exploiting the target. Usually, they are used to gather or steal information from target's device. That information could be files, saved passwords, dumping hashes, enumerating other services and applications on the target, and many other things we can do with post-exploitation modules. After you type ls, you will see that they are mostly split the same as the exploits. If we go to Windows post-exploitation modules and type ls right here, we will see different post-exploitation submodules that have different purposes, such as gathering information, such as escalating privileges. And these escalating privileges simply means if we exploit the target as a regular user on that machine, we would always want to try to escalate our privilege to become an administrator or a root account. We can also see VLAN post-exploitation modules, and I believe this would be used to steal saved wireless passwords to the access points that the target was connected to. Okay, you can explore the others as well if you want to, and let's talk about the others as well, so we can go through all of them real fast so you can get a pretty good understanding of what all of these modules do. And the next one that we will talk about is also really important, and that is payloads. If I change directory to payloads, clear the screen and type ls, and hopefully you remember that payload is something we deliver to the target with an exploit in order to control that machine. And in this payloads directory, we can see it is split in three different subdirectories: singles, stagers, and stages. What does this even mean? Well, singles are payloads that are completely standalone. A single payload can be something as simple as adding a user to the target system or running some other application. Stagers set up a network connection between the attacker and victim and are designed to be small and reliable. And lastly, stages are payload components that are downloaded by stagers modules. These payload stages can provide us with advanced features with no size limits, such as, for example, different command shells or meterpreter shells. And meterpreter is something that we mentioned for the first time. Meterpreter shell is also something that we will use a lot. It is similar to the command shell, but with a bunch of other options as well besides executing commands. We can download files, upload files, record microphone conversation, run webcams on target machine, take screenshots of their desktop, and many other things we can do with the meterpreter. So once we are exploiting a target, meterpreter is usually what we want to run on that target after an exploit. If I go to stagers directory right here, so cd stagers, clear the screen, type ls, and if I, for example, go to Windows stagers, type ls, here we can see different ways of establishing connection. Remember when we talked about two different types of shells in the last video? Well, here they are. Here we can establish a connection either by binding to a port or by listening and creating a reverse shell connection. They are further divided into, for example, reverse HTTP, reverse UDP, and reverse TCP. And out of all of these that we have right here, we will almost always use reverse TCP. So for now we know that two main things we will combine in a payload is reverse TCP connection and a meterpreter shell, because that two combined give us much more options to do with the target. Okay, great. Now, if you don't understand some of this, don't worry once again. This is something that you will fully understand once we get into the practical examples. For now, we're left to explain 3 more modules, and we're going to go quickly through them since they are less important than the ones that we already covered. And those are the evasion modules, encoders, and NOPs. Now, let's go with encoders first. Encoders are something that helps us to evade antivirus detection. How exactly? Well, even though we call our payload a shell or a meterpreter, what it is to antiviruses and other people, it is just a simple malware or Trojan or a virus. That's why, with the help of encoders, we can encode our payload and make it less detectable by some antivirus vendors. These are not that useful anymore since they are known to almost all antiviruses. They can, however, help us bypass some of them. And evasion modules do pretty much the same thing. And if I change directory to them, so cd evasion, you will see that there are evasion modules only for Windows. And they are used to bypass Windows Defender. If I change my directory right here, type ls, we will see different Windows Defender files that we use in order to bypass the Windows Defender. However, since Windows Defender recently got an update, I believe many of these don't work anymore. But don't worry, we will see later in the course different techniques that we can use to bypass antiviruses and execute our payload. And the last thing that we got are NOPs. NOPs can be a little bit hard to understand. What a NOP is an instruction for the processor to do nothing. Once a processor reads a NOP instruction, it does absolutely nothing. And I know what you're thinking, what is the purpose of this for us? Well, these NOPs are useful in buffer overflows to allocate a lot of space in memory before the payload executes. By the way, NOP stands for no operations, and if you ever programmed in assembly before, you will be familiar with this. But don't worry, for now, NOPs are not that important for us. Okay, that was a lot to take for one single video, but all of this will be more clear once we start exploiting our target, and trust me, we're really close to that. We just need to explain the usage of Metasploit in the next video real quick, and after it, we will perform our first exploits. So get ready, and I will see you in the next video. Welcome back. In the previous video, we talked about Metasploit framework structure. We explained all of the modules and what they are for, but we haven't really ran the framework itself. In this video, we're going to run it and cover some of the basic commands for it. Okay, I already mentioned in the last video that to open this framework, what we must do is open our terminal and type msf console. Press enter, and keep in mind that it might take some time to open, especially if you're running it for the first time. And here it is, it already opened for me, and what we get right here is we get the banner of Metasploit framework, which changes every time you start this program, And down here, we get these 7 modules that we talked about. And we also get the exact number of modules that we have available to us. So here we can see 2043 exploits, 1105 auxiliary modules, 344 post-exploitation modules, over 500 payloads, and a little bit of encoders, NOPs, and evasion modules. As in every other tool that we covered, to see all the available commands we can use, we can run the help command. This will open the help menu, which will give us all the available options, as well as some of the examples of how we can use Metasploit. But for now, this is not necessary, as I will show you a few of these commands that you will use every time. And by the way, before we get into those commands, what you can do inside of the Metasploit framework, you can also run the normal commands, such as ls, such as changing directories, such as, for example, running ifconfig. So if I type sudo ifconfig and type in my password, it will give me the output of ifconfig. So you can also run regular terminal commands from this. But as far as the Metasploit framework goes, let's start with listing some of the modules. For example, we can use the show command to list out any type of modules we want. So we know that there are over 500 payloads. We saw the number once we started the Metasploit. In order to list all of those 500 payloads, we can type show and then payloads. If I press enter, it will take just a few seconds and it will list out all of the available payloads that we have. Now right here, this is not really that good of an output because I have my terminal a little bit more zoomed in than I should have, so I will just go to the preferences and lower the font of my letters. So I'll click on OK, apply, OK, clear the screen, and I will type show payloads once again. It's still not that good. Let me just go and lower it a little bit more. So I will just go to 13, apply, and click on OK. Clear the screen, run the command again, and here it is. We get a better output. So let's explain what we see right here. If I scroll all the way up to the beginning, we can see this is the number of the payload. It goes from 0 to over 500, and this right here is the name of the payload. So as we already know, there are bind shells and reverse shells. So we get different types of them. We can see the payloads for Android, the payloads for Apple iOS. We can see all types of payloads, command shells. We can see Java payloads, Linux payloads, if I go all the way down, OS X payloads, PHP payloads, Python, Ruby, and a bunch of others as well. Here's also Windows payloads. So we get a lot of them. Under the rank, they're all manual because they have to get executed on the target machine. And in the description, we can see for what this payload is. For example, if we check out this one, Apple Meterpreter Reverse HTTP, this is the Apple iOS Meterpreter shell or Reverse HTTP inline. So this means you would use this payload if you were, for example, attacking an Apple device. Now, we can do the same thing with exploits. If we want to list all of the 2000 exploits, we can type show exploits. And this might take a little bit longer because there is a lot more exploits than there is payloads. And here they are. Here are all 2041 exploits. You can see the output is pretty much the same as with the payloads. We get the number right here, we get the exploit name, and these exploit names are really well written. As we can see, the first part tells us for what is this exploit. Currently we are inside the Windows exploits. And if we scroll all the way up, we should see some other exploits as well. Let's go and scroll all the way up. Well, it seems that we can only go up to here because there is a lot of them. But nonetheless, we can see for what the exploits are. For example, this one is for Windows and for browser. And here it specifies exactly what does it exploit. If I go down here and, for example, check out these ones, here we can see this is also Windows exploit for the FTP. So they're very well organized, and this is the structure that we saw in the previous video. Just this is how the Metasploit framework outputs it for us. These exploits that belong to Windows FTP are all located inside of the FTP directory of the Windows exploits directory. If I go all the way down, and what we can do right here is we can choose one of these exploits, just to see how we can select them and run them. Of course, we are not going to be attacking any target, we just want to see how we can select one of these exploits. So let's go with this one. For example, Windows SMB MS06 040 Net API. And by the way, to check out more information about exploits, we can go on to the right. So this exploit came out in 2006. And in the right column, right here, it tells us what exactly does this exploit do. So for this particular one, we get that it is an exploit for Microsoft Server Service, and it overflows this function. Now, the good part about this is that you don't really need to know how these work in order to be able to run them. Let me show you. If you copy this exploit name right here, so copy Windows SMB MS06 040 Net API, in order to select it, let us clear the screen, we can type the command use. And you type use and then the module name that you want to use. In our case, we want to use an exploit. And after it, all we have to do is paste the exploit name. So use exploit /windows /smb / and then the name of the exploit. Press enter. And we will see that this exploit configured payload Windows Meterpreter reverse TCP. And we will talk about this in just a second. For now, we can see that it is currently using the module that we selected, because it is printed out in red right here, and it also tells us that it is an exploit. So let's check out all the information that we can get for this exploit. The first thing that I always like to do is type the command show info. And this show info command tells us more about this particular exploit. So if we go down here to the description, it will tell us this module exploits a stack buffer overflow. So this is a buffer overflow exploit in the Net API 32 canonicalize path name function using this RPC. And you can read about any exploit that you select. Another information that we get right here are some of the references. So you can visit these links right here to read more about this particular exploit. Besides this, another command that we can do is show options. And this is the important part. Let me just clear the screen and type it once again just so we can see only the options part. Here is where you select your options for the exploit. First thing we see is module options, and it asks us for 3 different things. And keep in mind, different exploits will want different things. Usually they will all have these rhosts and rport, which is just the remote host and the remote port, or in our case, the target's IP address and the target's port that we're attacking. So we can see 2 of these are already automatically set. The R port is already set to be 445 and the SMB pipe is already set to be the browser. All we are left to specify right here is the R hosts, or the IP address of the target machine. So if we were attacking a Windows server that was vulnerable to this attack, we would specify here the IP address of that Windows server machine. And in this column right here, you will notice that some of these things will be required and some of these things will not be required. In our case, in this particular exploit, all of these 3 things are required to specify in order for exploit to work. In the description, it tells us exactly what it wants from us, so the R hosts is the target host, or the target's IP address. The R port is the SMB service port on the target machine, and the SMB pipe is the pipe name to use. So these are the exploit options. And down here, we get payload options. Now what does this mean? Well, remember, after exploiting the target, we drop a payload. So by default, remember once we ran the command to use this exploit, it gave us Windows Meterpreter reverse TCP by default. This means that we're using a payload for Windows. It is a Meterpreter shell, which remembers it is the best shell that we can get. And it is a reverse shell over TCP connection. You can change this if you want to, and down here we get the options that we need to set for payload. Remember, once using reverse shell, we must listen on our Cal Linux machine for the incoming connection. And that's the information that it asks us right here. The L host is our own IP address, the IP address of Cal Linux machine. Or as it says right here, the listening address. We specify our IP address right here, so you just need to type sudo ifconfig. And we can see 192.168.1.9. Usually the Metasploit framework will set it by default. So let me just clear the screen, run show options once again. And the L port is the listening port, or Cal Linux port that we want to listen for the incoming connections. And it is usually set by default to be 4444. And all of these options you can change. For example, if you notice that Metasploit framework set the incorrect IP address for a Cal Linux machine, you can type set and then the parameter name, in our case lhost, to be a different IP address. For example, 192.168.1.15. And it will set the lhost parameter to be a different IP address, as we can see right here. Inside of these R hosts, as we can see this is also required, we would set the IP address of our target machine. So let's say we had a Windows server and its IP address was 192.168.1.20. We would type it right here, so 192.168.1.20. And if I type show options once again, now we got this set as well. Now, payload is something that you can change. Usually you want to leave it what Metasploit framework already gave you, because the default one is usually the best one. But sometimes some of the payloads will not work and others will work. So in order to see all of the available payloads that you can use for this particular exploit, you can type show payloads once again. Just this time it will not list out all the 500 possible payloads, it will only list out the possible payloads for this particular exploit. And this will be all the Windows payloads. Since we are attacking a Windows machine with this exploit, the Windows payloads will be something that we can use. So we can see some bind shells, reverse shells, we can see some of the meterpreter shells. So for example, let us say that you don't want to use a reverse shell, you want to use a bind shell. How would you change the payload? Well, you would copy the bind shell. Let's say we want to use the meterpreter bind shell, so copy its name. And go all the way down and type set payload and then paste the payload name. So paste selection, press enter, and it will tell us the payload has been changed. If I clear the screen, show options, we will see different payload. We no longer have the meterpreter reverse TCP, we now have the bind TCP meterpreter. And it will also ask us for different information about the payload. We no longer get the L host, since remember with bind TCP, it is not our Cal Linux machine that is listening for the connection, it is the target machine that is listening for the connection, and we are the ones that connect to it. So in this case, it is asking us for our host, or the remote host, or as the description says, the target IP address. So we would select right here the same IP address that we select right here, because it is the target that has to open the port, and the local port will be the local port on the target machine that will open for us to connect to. And you would select here whatever you want. So what is important to get out all of this is that we can change different options using set command. So you just type set, and then for example we want to change the L port, we type L port and then make it whatever we want. And if we type show options, it will be changed right here. And the last part that we see down here are the targets. And these targets right here are all of the vulnerable targets for this particular exploit. To list all of them out, we can type show and then targets. This will give us a list of all the targets that we can exploit using this attack. So we get Windows NT, Windows XP, and now different versions of Windows XP and Windows 2003. So this is an older exploit that attacks Windows XP machines. Now you can either, if you know exactly which version of Windows is the target running, you can select it right here by specifying set target and then the number. For example, let's say the target is using Windows XP SP1 English. You could type it like this, so set target 3, because the ID for that particular version is 3. Or if you didn't know exactly which version, you would just leave it on automatic, which means that Metasploit framework will figure it out on its own, so we don't need to specify it. The only important thing is that it is one of these versions. If it is, for example, a Windows 7 machine, this exploit will not work. And once you set all of these options, the last thing you need to do is type exploit. In our case, this will not work because we don't really have a vulnerable Windows XP machine, so it will give us an exploit failed error. In this case, it is unreachable because this IP address right here on my local network is not even online. That's why this will not work. And this is pretty much it. Now, there are other commands as well that could be useful, but these are the main ones that we always use to choose exploits and payloads and to set their options. Finally, the time has come. In the next video, we're going to apply what we learned for now to perform our first exploit on the Metasploitable machine. See you in the next video.